Hello and welcome to another video from the only source of information that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse, but actually enjoy it. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the final update on the progress that I have made on my Chevy 1-ton truck. In case you haven't seen the previous videos in this series, just know that I purchased a derelict Chevy 3500 dually pickup a while back for $300. with the intention of restoring it. I have built custom cars before and had sworn long ago to never engage in such a thing again. I should have stuck to that, but my friend convinced me that if I purchased the truck, he would give me an engine and install it for me. He knew that I did not have the tools to do such a thing, nor did I have the physical strength to do such a thing, and in fact, I did not even have the necessary skill set to do such a thing. As part of the deal, I actually purchased two trucks, one for him and one for me. This was going to be a buddy project, with the two of us building two trucks and taking them to car shows together after they were completed. I was so dead set against building another car that no man alive other than my best friend could have convinced me to do so. In fact, he couldn't even have done such a thing had he not offered to do the engine work for me, for free. Well, sadly, the whole thing was a setup. My so-called friend never intended to help me with my truck in any way. He simply wanted me to purchase a truck for him and give him the parts that he needed to rebuild his truck. Everyone who knows my history of being taken advantage of by people posing as my friends is probably thinking that I have got to be the biggest sucker alive. And you would be correct. When I am with someone and they are laughing at the things that I laugh at, and angry about the things that make me angry, and believing in all the things that I believe in, I simply associate them with the kind of person that I am. Every good person wants friends, and every selfish person perceives goodness as weakness. That is simply how it works. It is exactly how things have been from the first moment that the very first human being developed the ability to be selfish. I have understood this concept from childhood, but I always seem to foolishly believe that this time is going to be different. As you all already know, I love everyone alive, and I automatically expect, and rightfully so, that everyone that I love is loving me back. There's more than enough evidence that this is not the case. But for a person like myself, it is simply unbelievable that any human being would be willing to trade love for material things. Another problem with being a good person is that I have never once in my life pretended to be evil, and in fact, have never once in my life wanted to pretend to be anything other than what I am. Because of this, my mind simply cannot process the fact that evil people spend nearly every second of their lives pretending to be good. The ability to seem like a good person is the single most effective weapon in an evil person's arsenal. The concept of living a fake life is so offensive to me that it is difficult to understand how any human being could possibly be capable of doing such a thing. I have probably had about a half dozen best friends over the course of my life, and each and every one of those friendships ended in basically the same way. I opened up my heart to them, talk about everything that is important to me, including things about my past and what I have planned for the future, all the while doing so as my so-called best friends were taking careful notes about how that information could be used to strip me of my money, my possessions, and my dignity. The man who stole my truck was also my best friend, so I should have been expecting this. But this time around, my friend was uniquely different from all of the previous best friends that I had had. Unlike those who acted as my best friends for a year or two, I have been friends with this particular person for about 30 years, and it wasn't just me. My mom and dad were friends of his family as well. Another thing that makes my relationship with him unique is that my parents and myself have always helped his family out in any way that we could. My dad taught me early on that it is our responsibility to take care of people who are not as fortunate as ourselves. My father was a Sears repairman for most of his life, and when he wasn't working for Sears, he was working for the elderly and disabled for practically nothing. He would do hundreds of dollars worth of work on his days off, but only charged the less fortunate a token amount, usually what it cost him for gas to drive to their homes. He did not want his needy customers to feel as if they were getting charity, even though it would have been obvious to anyone paying attention that they were. My friend's family has always been in need, and my family has always been there to help them in any way that we could. Any of you who have been watching my videos for a while understand that my wife is mentally handicapped and mentally ill. That is a big part of why I have always felt so close to my friend. His wife suffers from a very similar condition. They are not exactly the same, but they do share a lot of bizarre character traits that make it obvious to everyone who meets them that they are not able to function like normal people. Just as an example, a few years ago, someone was going into the local cemetery and stealing toys off of the graves of children. A hidden camera was set up, and eventually my friend's wife was caught on video leaning over a fence and using some kind of pole to grab a bunch of damp, moldy, stuffed animals off of a grave marker. The video was played on the local news, and she was arrested. Over the years, my parents and I have done everything that we could for our family friends, never expecting anything back. I personally have given him thousands of dollars worth of tools and car parts and even entire cars. When his computer went out, I purchased a new computer so that I could give him my two old computers. I have helped him with projects around his property and even installed the floor in his house. I have cut down trees and removed them from his property, and of course, more recently, I have performed about 40 hours of hard physical labor on the restoration of his truck. I have never once asked him to pay for anything. The entire time that I was working on his truck, he was giving me lists of things to get for my truck. In total, when the time came to drive his truck out of the shop and push my truck in, over the course of the 4 months that I had spent working on our trucks, I had spent $3,000 on the truck, the parts, and the tools and chemicals that I would need to put the whole thing together. As the day neared for driving his truck out and pushing my truck in, I was obviously excited. I was pretty exhausted from working on his truck, but more than ready to get started on my own. But on the day when it was my turn, I opened up Facebook on my computer and found a message from his wife. I always dread seeing her name on my Facebook page because nothing that she has to say ever makes any kind of sense. Usually I try to respond to everything posted by everyone else before leaving some kind of one-word response for her and quickly closing Facebook before she has a chance to reply. Like my wife, if you say anything to her, you can expect to spend hours attempting to get away from her. What she said that day was odd, which is not all that unusual, but she wanted to know if I would let her borrow my pot hanger. I thought and thought about what thing I owned that might possibly be called a pot hanger that I could temporarily lend to her, but could not think of anything. So I simply told her that I did not know what a pot hanger was and instantly closed my Facebook page. I did not give her question a second thought because nothing that she says ever means anything in the real world. It is not unusual to walk away from a conversation with her having absolutely no idea what the conversation was about. But when I got to my friend's house, his attitude towards me had completely changed. Instead of greeting me with a smile and helping me to push my truck into his shop, he erupted into a rage, screaming at me to get out of his shop. In 30 years, I have never once seen my friend angry at anybody about anything. It was mind-blowing, but I immediately understood that once again, someone had pretended to be my friend in order to take advantage of me. I had been going to his shop, talking to him about my dream truck for at least 2 decades, always reminding him to keep an eye out for something that I could afford, always keeping him up to date on how much money I had available. I had been saving up to purchase a truck for most of my life, but somehow some kind of emergency had always come up requiring that I spend my truck money on something else. For the last 3 years, I have not had any kind of financial emergency. And as a result, the amount of cash in my secret drawer had grown to the point where I could actually, finally, get the truck that I had been fantasizing about for all those years. It was wonderful to know that soon I would have a vehicle capable of carrying a camper. I was spending most of my spare time looking at classified ads for truck campers. I could not stop thinking about all of the places that I was going to visit once I got my truck completed. After screaming at me, I, true to form, reasoned with him that I hadn't done anything to deserve being treated that way. He got his composure together for a moment and assured me that he was just kidding with me, like he always does. I can promise you that in the 30 years that I have known him, I had never witnessed him, or anybody else for that matter, kidding with anybody like that. I went home and spent the next 3 days losing sleep and praying that I was only imagining what I already knew in my heart. I was broke, and I had absolutely no way to recover financially if he did not fulfill his part of the bargain. All of the things that I purchased would have no value to me whatsoever without someone to put them all together. Little did I know at the time, the list of things that he said I needed were actually things that he needed. He had no intention of letting me have the parts that I had purchased and cleaned and painted. In the meantime, I got another message from his wife explaining that a pot hanger is a thing that you hang pots on. I had actually kind of figured that out on my own, but still had no idea what she meant. So I wrote back to her asking if she was talking about the steel tripod that I use when cooking with my Dutch ovens over an open fire. Each time after talking to her, I would eventually go back to the shop and talk to him. And his behavior towards me got worse and worse. It had become more than obvious that he had my money, he had my parts, he had gotten about 40 hours of free labor out of me, and that he had absolutely no intention of paying me back and no longer wanted me around. My dream truck had once again become nothing more than an unachievable fantasy. In just another 2 years, I would have had enough money to purchase a truck that actually ran, but now I was once again back to where I started 3 years earlier. I have struggled all of my life to develop friendships out here in the real world, simply because as a human being, that is what I am designed to do. Nothing on this earth can ever be as valuable as a friendship. God did not create us to acquire money, build up our credit scores, or get more stuff than our neighbors. We are all designed and created to love one another. Anything else is a perversion. I really don't understand why anyone would invest any time into developing a friendship for any reason other than to have a friend. As things progressed, his wife's behavior got worse and worse as well. It was obvious that in their spare time together, they were coming up with more and more excuses for hating me. After asking her if she wanted to borrow my cooking tripod, she wrote back, "You know what I'm talking about. I saw it at your house. I saw your cast iron skillets hanging on it." At this point, I am really confused. All of my cast iron skillets hang from the frame of my front porch. I wouldn't call the frame of my front porch a pot hanger, and I certainly would never ask someone if I could borrow the frame of their front porch. I wrote back telling her that my skillets were hanging on hooks that I purchased at the hardware store, which were screwed permanently into the frame of my house, thinking that would put an end to the nonsense. I know that it sounds insane, because it is insane. But I'm pretty sure that my friend cannot steal from someone without first generating some kind of excuse for doing so. It was becoming more and more obvious that the excuse that he was going to use on me is that I did not deserve my truck because I blatantly refused to lend his wife my pot hanger. After about 3 days, I got another message from her saying, "You still haven't answered my question." I wrote back, "What question?" Her reply, "Are you going to give me a pot hanger or not?" It is at this point that I felt like I had nowhere to hide, so I simply asked her, "Are you suggesting that I disassemble part of my house, bring it to your house, and install it over there?" Somehow I must have gotten through, because that ended the conversation, but it didn't put an end to the problems with her husband. I returned to the shop on several occasions to clean my truck and install wheels on it so that I could post it on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and try to recover some of the money that I had invested. I figured that I could sell the truck for at least $500. But each time I went over there, my friend confronted me with some kind of excuse about why I couldn't work on my truck. In the weeks leading up to the completion of his truck, he was constantly assuring me that I could use any of his tools that I needed. I could work in his shop or out in the yard. I could use his electricity, water, and air. I could even use his cleaning supplies, lubricants, and shop towels. He also told me that I was welcome there any time that I wanted to work on my truck and that I didn't need to call ahead. But once his truck was completed, everything changed. At that point, I could not work in his shop or in his yard, nor could I use his tools or anything else of his. And every time that I drove over there, he asked me why I hadn't called first. Without access to my truck, I had no choice but to simply move on with my life and try to just forget about the whole thing. I didn't just walk away. I tried on multiple occasions over the course of a month to work on my truck. But each time, he ran me off. It was more than obvious that he had it in his heart to keep me away from my truck and was willing to do whatever it took to run me off. It didn't take long to figure out that he intended to strip me of my truck, my parts, my tools, and all of my other supplies. I know that everyone listening to this is going to want to make suggestions about how to solve this problem. Trust me, I have been thinking about this for more than a month. I have spoken to a friend of mine who is a law enforcement officer, and he confirms that there is absolutely nothing that the police can do to help me. and that the only solution would be to take him to court and prove to a judge that he owes me $3,000. But without receipts, serial numbers, and signed contracts, the possibility of doing such a thing would be non-existent. My friend had obviously thought this through. As most of you already know, the only thing that is really important to me is this: my YouTube channel. Everything else is just a distraction. Don't get me wrong. It injured me deeply that someone that I loved had betrayed me in such a cruel way. And I certainly was disappointed that after years of saving my money, the dream of finally getting a truck was gone forever. But I would get over it. As far as the truck goes, I just took it that God was telling me that He did not want me to have a truck. I would be okay. Not immediately, but eventually. Eventually, I would be okay. However, my mom had been deeply interested in my truck and had been coming over to the shop every week or so to check on my progress. She called me one day and said that she was coming over to see what I had gotten done on the truck since the last time she was there. All that I could do was tell her that I wasn't at the shop that day. I knew that there was no way to get out of revealing what had happened to me, and I knew that she would be hurt, but I never imagined how much. I drove to her house and I told her that the friend that our family had been taking care of for all these years had defrauded me out of all of my money, my truck, and all of the parts that I had purchased. She was inconsolable. I did everything that I could to explain that it was not that big of a deal and that God probably just didn't want me to have a truck or a camper. But my mom is not a spiritual person. All that she could think about was somehow forcing him to do what he promised to do, or to sue him. She kept calling me to suggest different plans of action for getting my truck back, or where to go to get an engine, or who to hire to get the work done on the truck. It was obvious that she could not stop thinking about what had been done to me. But I had already thought everything through. And there was no possibility of ever turning my truck into something that could be driven. Two buddies working on a truck together doesn't really cost that much. But having a derelict truck professionally restored would have cost more money than I could have ever hoped to have acquired. Plus, it wasn't just a truck. My friend had all the parts and supplies that I had purchased, meaning that I would be forced to start all over from scratch. I initially figured on spending $4,800 on rebuilding my truck. I didn't have that much, but was hoping to be able to eventually come up with the money as the work progressed. Adding together what I had already spent to the amount that I would have had to pay to get the work done would have come to at least $40,000. An amount that would have been impossible for me to come up with ever. Plus, the kind of truck that I had can normally be found online somewhere in nearly mint condition for about half that amount. I will never have that much money either. I went back a few days later to check on my mom, and she looked awful. I could tell that she had not slept well, and I am certain that she had been crying. My mom is 79 years old, and she is not taking this well at all. I couldn't even have a conversation with her that day because she couldn't focus long enough to comprehend what I was saying. And of course, I was feeling like it was all my fault. I left my mom's house, and on the way home, my brother called me to tell me that he had just lost his job due to the so-called pandemic. And he was crying as well. For the last 30 days or so, I have been so depressed that I simply cannot function. I have been constantly calling my brother, trying to console him, and driving over to my mom's house to try and console her. In my mom's mind, both of her sons' lives have been shattered, and there is no way to convince her otherwise. Every time that I would drive up there, I would see my stolen truck just sitting just down the street from my mom's house. And I knew that my mom was seeing the same thing every time she left her home. As badly as I wanted to simply walk away, I didn't really feel like I had that choice. I had to do something to get that truck out of there. I prayed about it and prayed about it. And the only thing that I could come up with was to sell it to the scrapyard and have them snatch it out of there with their wrecker before my friend could do anything about it. Since he rarely makes it out to his shop before noon, I was really hoping that the wrecker would get there early in the morning. That's not how it worked out. The wrecker was running behind and did not call me till later in the afternoon. I told him that I would meet them there and prayed about it all the way to his shop. The guy from the scrapyard knew me and my friend and had witnessed me paying for my friend's parts on multiple occasions. I knew that my friend could say that he had a lien on my truck, or that I owed him a storage fee, or some other kind of evil nonsense. But I was really hoping that he would be too ashamed of what he had done to say something that stupid in front of someone who knew me, knew him, and knew that I had been paying for his parts. By the time that the guy who stole my truck realized that I was out there, it was too late. The wrecker showed up and backed up to my truck, and in about an hour was driving away. My friend didn't say a thing, but it was obvious that he was extremely frustrated. I even got him to help load it on the wrecker. I was so relieved to see it gone that I cried after I left the shop. I wasn't crying tears of sadness, but tears of relief. I had already decided that if I had not succeeded in getting that truck out of his yard, I would have sneaked back up there in the middle of the night and set the truck on fire. As risky as that would have been, there was no way that I was going to just leave it there to taunt my mom for the rest of her life. An even more frightening prospect was the thought that he might get my truck in running condition and spend the rest of my mom's life driving it past her house. About a week before I was able to get it towed off, I sneaked up early in the morning and grabbed as much as I could out of my truck. Initially, I had been storing all of the parts that I had been buying in his shop. But one day I found out that the spot where I was putting my parts had been coated with paint because of overspray. Sandblasting, polishing, and painting truck parts is very hard work that I really did not want to have ruined by someone else's carelessness. So I started putting my restored parts in the cab of the truck instead of in the shop, just to keep them from getting damaged. I had no idea that he was going to steal all my stuff, so I did not move it out to the truck to keep him from stealing it. I really did not have a clue. I knew that I would never be able to go anywhere near the shop once he realized that I had been taking parts out of my truck, but I really wanted to get as much of my stuff out of there as possible before he moved everything into his shop where I could never retrieve it. Obviously, I don't have any use for a bunch of Chevrolet truck parts, but after my so-called friend tricked me out of all of my money, I just felt like I had to recover as much of what he had stolen as possible. The next day, I drove past the shop and saw that the door was open and that he had a customer. I figured that if I was ever going to get any more of my stuff, that would probably be the only opportunity. I let him know that I was there, and he immediately informed me that he had a customer in the shop and that I would be in his way. I walked out of the shop, But instead of going home, I went into his office to try to grab more of my stuff. But within minutes, he went running past the window, frantically searching for me. He very obviously was already aware that I had gotten a lot of my parts out of my truck on the previous day and wanted to make sure that I didn't get anywhere near my truck again. When he finally figured out that I was in the office, he came running in. His face was red, he was breathing hard, he was shaking and obviously in another rage. It was at that point that I gave up on retrieving any more of my stuff and left. I could see some of my things scattered around his office, but none of that stuff was worth getting into a confrontation over, especially when you consider that I no longer had any use for any of it. As I just said, without a Chevrolet truck, I really don't need a bunch of Chevrolet truck parts. When it was all said and done, he really didn't benefit much from what he had done to me. He probably got less than $1,000 worth of truck parts. He got about 40 hours of free labor and about $410 in cash and shop supplies. As bad as this story sounds, there is actually a lot of good that came out of it. For 3 decades, I had been using precious resources to help those people out in any way that I could. At this point, the cost of all those resources would be much greater than the $3,000 that he cost me this time around. Had he not revealed what kind of person he is, I would still be wasting my time and money on him for the remainder of my life. But it's not just him that I was wasting my life on. Since all of this has happened, I have not only cut him off from the welfare pump, but all of my other so-called friends as well. As one of the poorest men in South Mississippi, I have decided that it is no longer my job in life to help a bunch of selfish, wasteful people with their living expenses. Even my best friend Tonto has been cut off. I love him very much, and I swore to myself that I would get him in front of a doctor and make sure that he was on his way to resolving his health issues. Before I ran him off, I accomplished that goal. Whether he lives or dies is not my responsibility. He has plenty of family who should be looking out for him, especially since he is the only one bringing in any kind of income. I have him set up with all of the specialists that can treat whatever is wrong with him. So I no longer feel any obligation to continue taking care of him. Initially, I did not understand the nature of this so-called pandemic and thought that it would be all over in a month or so. I only allowed Tonto to stay at my house because he had nowhere else to go. The library, where he had been spending the majority of his time for the last 50 years, has been closed until further notice. The first time that he left my house to go to work, he asked me if he could take something to eat for lunch. I said yes. And he proceeded to fill up a grocery bag with enough food to keep him fed for a couple of days. It was funny at first, but only because I figured I could restock my pantry in a week or two when the pandemic was over and he was gone. But after about 4 months, it wasn't as funny as it was at first. I explained the nature of my finances to him on several occasions in the hope that he would stop stripping my pantry. But it didn't really seem to have any effect. The last time that he stayed at my house, I asked him if he would follow up with his medical treatments or if I would have to constantly be having to remind him and having to take him to his doctor's appointments. He assured me that he would be able to follow through with his treatments on his own. So at that point, I explained to him that I no longer wanted him coming around. He was obviously upset, but I explained to him that I could not afford to continue supporting him due to my limited resources, something that I had been subtly trying to get across to him from the beginning. he had the option of right then and there paying me something for all that I had done for him. And I kind of thought that he would. He asked me to take him to the bank so that he could get me some gas money. I was actually worried that he would do the right thing and that I would get manipulated out of running him off. When he came out of the bank, he gave me a $5 bill. I was so relieved to see that he had not chosen to do the right thing. $5 was not even enough to pay for the gas that he had burned up that day, much less the previous 100 or so times that I had chauffeured him around town. But best of all, after I took the $5 bill, he told me to pick him up in the morning at 8 to take him to the hospital. I told him no, and he immediately snatched the $5 bill out of my hand. Problem solved! I am now officially free from all of the selfish leeches who have been taking advantage of my kindness over the years. I will not be taking on any new cases. The pattern that Tonto followed was the same exact pattern that had been followed by the friend that defrauded me out of all of my money, and in fact, the pattern set by every other close friend that I have ever had. Seemingly, every single citizen of Lord Satan's empire has a set dollar amount for what I must pay for their friendship. I told Tonto to give me a call during an upcoming local event called Cruising the Coast, and I would come pick him up, and we would drive around looking at all of the classic cars together, and afterwards we could go get something to eat. When and if he calls, I will make sure to tell him that it is his turn to pay. I'm pretty sure that I'll be going by myself. I have always felt sorry for people that had to live on very little money, especially knowing that all of my needs are well taken care of by the money that I have coming in. But over the last few months, I have had my eyes opened up to the fact that every single person that I have ever helped in my life has had much more income to work with than me. In fact, during the time that I spent hanging out at my friend's shop, I got to witness firsthand that he and his wife actually have more than 3 times as much income as me. And even worse than that, back in the day when he and my dad were still working, he was making more money than me, my brother, and my parents combined. By all rights, if anybody should have been helping someone, it should have been him helping my family, and not the other way around. As far as I'm concerned, his sin of stealing my $3,000 was no worse than the 30-year sin of taking advantage of my family's good nature. Obviously, my friend's problem has never been a lack of income, but simply a horrendous mismanagement of that income. Now I'm going to share with you some really good news so that you won't go away from this video feeling sorry for me. Even though it took me 3 years to save up the initial money that I needed to purchase my truck, I have since saved up much more in just a matter of months. Because of this here so-called national emergency, everyone living on sub-poverty wages has been given increases in their financial resources through things such as the EBT program, formerly known as food stamps. I no longer have to use my income to purchase food, which means that I have much more money to work with. Also, I have received the same economic stimulus checks that the rest of you got. Just since March of this year, I was able to save up enough money, more money than I lost, and I spent it on a much nicer truck. It took every penny that I had, but it's officially mine. It already has an engine and transmission installed, and both seem to be working flawlessly. I'm currently unable to drive the truck because of problems with the brakes and suspension. but it is parked at a suspension shop right now. I have received an estimate for the repairs, and as of next week, I should have enough money to cover the cost of the repairs. By the time that civilization's current cycle of nonsense comes to an end and my increased benefits are cut off, I should have a completely restored truck, large enough and powerful enough to carry me, my dog, and a camper just about anywhere that I want to go. I have made videos about my personal financial hardships before, and my subscribers have always taken care of me. When my old computer and camera stopped working, I made a video about it, and in a couple of days, my subscribers put about $2,000 in my PayPal account. I know that unless I say something right now, you will probably do the same thing again. But I really can't take any donations at this time. I know that in your hearts, many of you feel like you have to send me money, but with all of the money coming in from the government, it would simply be too risky. Health-wise, both me and my wife are not in the best of shape. Between the two of us, our medical expenses are probably about $1,000 per month. Because our income is so low, we have both been put into what is called indigent health care programs. My wife's expenses are being taken care of by Medicaid, and my expenses are being taken care of by the indigent health care program of the Veterans Administration. When I received my first check from YouTube, I was concerned that I might get kicked off the system for having too much money. But I was assured by the VA and Medicaid staff that even if YouTube paid me $10,000 per year, I would still be considered below the poverty line. So I haven't concerned myself with being booted off the system since then. I only get about $500 per year from YouTube and about $500 a year from subscriber donations. However, there is no way of knowing how my increased EBT payments and economic stimulus payments are going to be counted at tax time. I don't think that it will put me over my limit, but I really don't want to get in trouble for being greedy. Not only that, but as long as I'm receiving all of these added benefits, I should have no problem coming up with the money to complete the repairs to my truck. I am definitely not in any financial trouble at this time. I could be wrong, but I'm reasonably certain that the global pandemic will conclude on or around March 20th of 2021. That being the case, I probably won't be able to accept donations next year either. I'll know more when tax time rolls around and I have my next meeting with the Mississippi Department of Human Services. In any case, I'm really not too proud to beg. And if I ever find myself in any kind of real financial crisis, I will let you know. I would really like to be able to let those of you who regularly donate money to my channel keep on sending it, but that probably isn't a good idea at this time. I thank all of you who have donated, and even those of you who haven't. All support, whether it be physical or spiritual, is appreciated. If I were to cross some kind of government-recognized poverty threshold, I could find myself experiencing more financial hardship than I have ever been in my entire life. Another $2,000 in donations would not even put a dent in my current medical bills. Were I to lose my government-funded medical resources, I would be in some really bad trouble. If you notice, I did not reveal the names of those who defrauded me out of my truck money. I really don't want anyone to try to locate them and force them to give back what they stole from me, or worse. It has been my experience that people like that do not need any help feeling miserable. I'm certain that they already are. Their self-worth is based on artificial things like money, credit scores, and material possessions. Things that do not have the power to make anyone happy. If God feels that they need to be punished, He will take care of it. In fact, it may even have been God who directed them to strip me of my resources and humiliate me one final time in preparation for what is about to come upon this earth. Things are only going to get worse, and we all need to be ready to endure whatever horrors await us as we prepare for the return of our Lord Jesus Christ. As the day nears, those who trust the human rulers of this world are going to be dedicating more time and effort into locating and doing harm to those of us who refuse to put our faith in their pitiable false gods. I hope that you all understand that recent events have caused me a great deal of anguish and made me pretty much useless spiritually. But I will be back to my old self soon enough. I know that my brother will snap out of his depression as soon as he gets back to work, and I am fully confident that very soon he will be back at work. My mom obviously is never going to forget what was done to me, but I am sure that once I give her a ride in my new truck, she will at least get over the loss of my old truck. It's really going to be nice, and I'm really excited about it. My mom sold her truck before Hurricane Katrina. Prior to that, either me, my brother, my mom, or my dad had always had a truck. In our family, the truck, no matter whose name it was in, has always been thought of as community property. Trucks are a really handy thing to have when you need 20 sacks of mulch, or you need to carry a bunch of rubbish to the local landfill. As soon as I get my truck out of the repair shop, I'll make a video so I can show it off. At this time, I am thoroughly convinced that no matter what happens, I am never again going to be giving handouts to useless eaters. I feel that I have a very important mission to carry out, and that mission is not to take care of greedy people who don't have the ability to manage their money. If they want to steal, swindle, defraud, and take advantage of someone, they are going to have to do it to one another. As Jesus said, no matter what you do, you will always have the poor. Please learn from my example. God loves those who cares for others. But as 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10 commands, we are not to take care of users. As I said, I hope you can learn from my example and not go through what I've been through. Thank you for watching. I love you all, and as always, if you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.